They said I was overreacting, that I was just a bitter old man clinging to a rocky hill. But I knew better. I knew what happens when you drop dynamite next to fractured granite. I warned them again and again. And they laughed, until the ground cracked open beneath their million-dollar homes. The HOA thought they could blast through my ridge to build their precious shortcut. They didn't care about the fault line, about the risk, about the lives built into this land. But when the streets split in half and driveways collapsed into the earth suddenly, I wasn't the crazy one anymore. This isn't just a story about an explosion. It's about arrogance, about power unchecked, and what happens when the earth finally says enough. There's a kind of silence you only find at elevation. My house sat atop a high ridge that sloped gently toward the tree line like a folded blanket. I bought the place 12 years ago, shortly after I retired from the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a modest home by anyone's standard, single-story wraparound porch, wind-bent pines at the back. But it had peace. That rare, sacred kind of peace you fight your whole life to deserve. My wife Carol and I had restored it ourselves. She painted every plank of siding with her own steady hands, and I rebuilt the stone wall stone by stone until my palms were raw. After she passed, I kept the place up like it still mattered to someone else, because in some ways it did. That ridge was the last place her laughter lived, echoing faintly whenever the wind moved through the chimes she'd hung herself. So when the first neon orange survey flags appeared planted like invasive weeds across the lower slope, I felt my stomach drop hard enough to bruise. At first, I thought it might be a utility crew doing a routine line inspection, or maybe a misrouted property marker from the county. But 2 days later, a convoy of white SUVs bearing bold Summit Heights HOA decals rolled in like they already owned the mountain. A man in a reflective vest waved a clipboard at me as I walked down to meet him. "You the property owner on Ridgeview Way?" "I am," I said, deliberately stepping between him and the tallest pine he was eyeing. "What exactly is this about?" "Preliminary survey," he answered curtly. "New access road, HOA initiative to reduce neighborhood congestion and give emergency vehicles better turnaround clearance." "On whose land?" I asked, voice already edged. "Easement was approved 3 weeks ago. Runs along the lower ridge. Just skirts your lot line by a few feet." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's granite down there. Solid metamorphic rock for 20 feet at minimum." "We're aware," he said, not looking up from his clipboard. "That's precisely why we'll be using controlled blasting." The words hit me like cold water poured straight down my spine. "You're telling me the HOA is going to dynamite the base of my ridge?" "Standard procedure, sir. Safe, efficient, and fully permitted." Except it wasn't fully permitted, not yet. The following morning, I marched down to the HOA office, a glossy glass and steel building that looked like it had been ordered from a catalog of soulless suburban ambition. The girl at the front desk barely lifted her eyes from her phone. "Are you a member of Summit Heights?" "No," I said. "I'm what you call a boundary owner. Adjacent landholder, which gives me every legal right to challenge unauthorized use, especially when explosives are involved." She blinked twice. "One moment, please." They made me wait 45 minutes in a lobby that smelled of lemon, disinfectant, and quiet contempt. And then she walked in. Not just any Karen, the Karen. HOA President Karen Atwell, designer sunglasses, pushed up into perfectly highlighted hair, red blazer sharp enough to cut glass, French manicure sharp enough to gut a fish. She smiled the way realtors do right before they lie about flood zones. "Mr. Easton," she said with practiced cheer that didn't reach her eyes, "I hear you're concerned about our little infrastructure upgrade. I'm concerned about someone dropping shaped charges on fractured granite within 50 feet of my foundation." "It's not fractured granite, Mr. Easton. It's mapped bedrock. Our engineers have reviewed the site extensively." "You mean the same engineers who misspelled topography on the permit application?" I asked, holding up a photocopy. Her smile stiffened by a single degree. "The plan has been voted on and approved by the board. As a non-member, your input is appreciated but not binding, except when the blast radius infringes on private property, threatens soil integrity, and activates subsurface stress zones," I snapped. "That ridge isn't just rock. It's a load-bearing shelf. You weaken it, and you don't just compromise my home. You compromise every house you claim to represent." Karen leaned back in her chair, folding her manicured hands like she was watching a mildly entertaining soap opera. Mr. Easton, I assure you we've had experts on this. You're welcome to file an objection, but it won't stop progress. I'd seen that look before in officers who'd never touched dirt, who issued orders from air-conditioned trailers while other men paid the price. Arrogance wearing the mask of vision. The kind that steamrolls procedure because someone with a title said, "Make it happen." I left without another word. Back home, I walked the ridge for hours, boots scuffing the same paths Carol and I had worn into the soil years ago. I used to love that view, the layered rise of hills beyond the neighborhood, the shimmer of rooftops below, like fish scales catching morning light. Now all I could see was a giant red X stamped across it by people who had never once looked up in awe. I could already hear the echo of detonation in my bones. It wasn't just about noise or vibration. It was about disruption of my land, my peace, and the last place my wife's laughter still lived. A week later, they brought in the drilling rigs. Heavy equipment clawed into soil that had never known the bite of steel. Trees I'd planted with Carol the first spring we owned the place were ripped out like weeds. I stood on my porch and filmed every minute, hands trembling with a rage I hadn't felt since Kandahar. A young technician in a Summit Heights safety vest gave me a sarcastic thumbs up as if destroying something irreplaceable was just another Tuesday. At night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like a warning. Every gust of wind felt like the prelude to collapse. I dragged out my old maps, my geology field kit, case notes from deployments in unstable terrain. I flew my drone at dawn and dusk, collecting seismic readings, thermal imagery, LiDAR overlays. I documented everything, because I had a feeling deep in the place where experience lives that when they finally lit the fuse, they wouldn't just wake the ridge. They'd wake something far older, far less forgiving than any of them could possibly understand. They didn't even try to be discreet about it. The morning of the blast, Summit Heights turned the lower ridge into a grotesque block party spectacle. Bright yellow cones lined the gravel service path like a parade route. Folding tables groaned under corporate banners that screamed, "Infrastructure for tomorrow," and "Community First Progress," in the same bold font they used for fining people over unapproved bird feeders. HOA board members in pressed khakis handed out cupcakes with little plastic hard hats on top, bottled water, and glossy trifold flyers showing 3D renderings of a scenic access boulevard that existed only in Karen Atwell's fevered imagination and a junior architect's laptop. She arrived fashionably late, in a red power suit so loud it could probably be heard in the next county, flanked by 2 local realtors and a drone crew filming the entire farce like it was the grand opening of a shopping mall. I watched from my porch in stunned silence, gripping the cedar railing so hard the wood groaned. A cupcake and dynamite party. What kind of HOA celebrates a detonation? I walked down toward the blast zone, staying strictly on my side of the property line, phone in hand, camera rolling. I wasn't there to stop them anymore. That ship had sailed the moment Karen smiled and said progress. I was there to document every second of their arrogance. A small crowd had gathered, mostly board members and their spouses, sipping mimosas at 10 in the morning. A handful of curious residents and 2 teenagers live streaming to their 37 followers with the caption, "HOA about to blow SHAT up, LOL." At the center of it all stood the cordoned-off blast zone neon tape and orange barrels forming a perfect rectangle around a crude trench that had been drilled along the base of the ridge. Detonation caps glinted like evil little eyes along the primer cord, wired and waiting. Karen stepped forward, holding a remote detonator the size of a garage door opener, as if it were the Olympic torch. She beamed for the drone camera, then turned to the crowd with the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her bathroom mirror. Today, she declared, voice bright and brittle, "We lay the foundation for Summit Heights' next evolution. This road will allow for faster emergency response, greater mobility," and she paused for maximum drama, "a stronger connection to the future." I almost laughed out loud. What she deliberately failed to mention was that the entire project had bypassed a formal environmental impact study, dodged a full geological risk assessment, and had zero backing from the county civil engineering board. She'd abused a dusty 2002 utility easement, rebranded it as a community road initiative, and rammed it through with votes bought by promises of lower dues and free landscaping consultations. Legal on paper, barely. Ethically, a ticking bomb. Someone started a drum roll by slapping an empty plastic bucket. 3, 2, 1. Boom. It wasn't a single clean pop like in the movies. It was a rapid-fire staccato of dull, sickening thuds, low and grinding, each one deeper than the last. The shockwave punched me in the sternum. Birds detonated out of the pines in a black cloud. A gray-brown dust geyser shot 30 feet into the air, followed instantly by the acrid smell of burned earth and ammonium nitrate. The crowd actually cheered cupcakes raised high like victory flags. But I heard something else entirely. A distant rolling crack. Not the sharp snap of surface rock, fracturing, not the ordinary pop and settle of a controlled blast. This was a groan, long, low, and ancient, the sound of something colossal shifting miles beneath our feet. The kind of sound you don't register with your ears first. You feel it in your molars, in the marrow of your spine. Karen didn't hear it. She was too busy posing for the drone, one hand on her hip, detonator held aloft like Simba on Pride Rock. I stayed down there long after the crowd dispersed, long after the tables were folded, and the drone crew packed their toys into a shiny black pickup. No one seemed interested in the ridge anymore. They had their footage, their cupcakes, their smug little PR victory. I wasn't after optics. I crouched beside the blast trench, careful not to cross the fluttering orange flags, and pressed a handheld seismic probe into the freshly scarred soil. My tablet flickered, then painted a picture that turned my blood to ice water. A ripple. Not the normal post-blast surface tremor. A delayed subsurface wave, weak but persistent, traveling northeast at an angle that made my throat close. I moved 20 feet east. Another reading. Stronger. That's when I saw the hairline fracture, no thicker than a credit card, zigzagging across a boulder the size of a pickup truck. I ran a gloved finger along it. The stone was warm, almost hot to the touch. That was not normal, not even close. I hiked back up the slope, legs burning, and called the one man I knew would believe me without hesitation. Leif Danner, structural geologist. Old Corps brother, the guy who'd pulled me out of a collapsed bridge abutment in Helmand and never let me forget it. "You're telling me an HOA just blasted at the base of a fault shelf?" he asked the second he picked up, voice already tight. I warned them, Leif, in writing, multiple times. They laughed. "Do you still have your 2014 LiDAR and the thermal soil maps from 2 years ago?" Every layer. There was zero activity until today. Silence on the line long enough to hear my own pulse. "I'm pulling the latest regional geological activity logs right now," he said finally. "Do not go poking around alone tonight. If you just repressurized a locked zone, you're sitting on a spiderweb that hasn't decided which way it wants to tear yet." I hung up and stared out at the ridge, the same ridge that had felt eternal for 12 years. For the first time since Carol died, it didn't feel solid anymore. It felt like something enormous, holding its breath. That night, Karen blasted out a neighborhood-wide email at 9:47 p.m., complete with a triumphant selfie of her holding the detonator beneath the glowing caption, "Another step toward progress. Safe, successful detonation completed. Minimal noise, zero issues. Onward." She even quoted a Dr. Randall Weissman, PhD senior geologist, who supposedly declared, "No geological hazards exist on the ridge." I looked him up in 30 seconds. The man was a podiatrist in Dayton, Ohio, with a Yelp page full of Bunyan testimonials. The woman was either delusional or banking on the fact that nobody else would bother to check. I printed every scrap of evidence, screenshots, video stills, raw seismic waveforms, the podiatrist's headshot next to his 5-star corn removal reviews. I filed an official complaint with the County Zoning and Infrastructure Office, knowing full well it would sit in a queue for weeks. That was exactly what Karen was counting on, bureaucratic molasses thick enough to drown any objection before it reached daylight. But she wasn't counting on me, because I wasn't just some retiree with a nice view and too much time. I was the guy who'd built pontoon bridges under mortar fire, who'd mapped fracture zones in earthquake rubble, while bodies were still being pulled from the rebar, who could read a slope the way sailors read clouds, and I could feel the ground remembering what had been done to it. The next morning, the sun rose behind a thin, ghostly veil of dust that still hadn't settled. It coated the pine needles silver, clung to the porch railing like ash, and turned the whole ridge the color of old bone. I stepped outside with black coffee and a heaviness in my chest I hadn't carried since Kandahar, the day a misplaced demo charge folded an entire supply road into a canyon and took 3 of my soldiers with it. Blasting zones, don't forget, they hold grudges in granite. I walked the upper slope with the slow, deliberate pace of a man counting steps across a minefield. Something was already wrong. A shallow, saucer-shaped depression had appeared overnight near the cluster of old manzanita roots. A hair-fine diagonal tension crack now traced the soil like a scar. Nothing dramatic yet, just the quiet, polite warnings that professionals learn to fear more than explosions. I spent the day compiling the technical case the way I used to compile after-action reports, geophones planted every 20 meters, pressure rods driven into the regolith drone-flying grid patterns with ground-penetrating radar. Years ago, I helped write the civilian fault mapping protocols for post-disaster reconstruction. Now I was using the exact same tools in my own backyard. At 4:30 p.m., I hand-delivered a thick red binder to the Summit Heights HOA office. I placed it squarely on the reception counter in front of Karen's assistant and spoke loud enough for the security cameras to hear every syllable. This is formal notice of pending hazard review and geotechnical dispute. Under Civil Code 6107 and State Statute 42A4, your board is now officially on notice of willful endangerment. The girl stared at the binder like it might bite her, then at me, then back at the binder. I left before she figured out which button called security. 2 hours later, the response arrived, a glossy community clarification bulletin pushed to every inbox in Summit Heights. Karen had written it herself. I recognized the passive-aggressive font. The misleading rumors circulating about the safety of our new road project. Please disregard unsubstantiated alarmism spread by unaffiliated parties. All activity complies with county permits and has been reviewed by licensed professionals. Rest assured, the HOA board remains steadfastly committed to your safety and comfort. Attached was a 15-second clip of me pacing along the orange flags, edited to make me look like a wild-eyed doomsday prepper, muttering to himself. It stung more than I wanted to admit. She knew exactly how to weaponize perception, how to shrink legitimate concern into background noise. Most residents didn't care. The blast site was out of sight, the cupcakes had been free, and Karen promised the new road would shave 4 whole minutes off the drive to Whole Foods. Only one neighbor answered my warnings directly. Marla Jameson, nurse, mid-40s, lived 4 houses down from the new cut. Her text came at 11:12 p.m. Michael, I don't know if I'm going crazy, but my garage floor is sloping, and the kids swear their dresser rattled last night. We're nowhere near the blast zone. Tell me I'm imagining this. I texted back immediately. You're not imagining anything. I'm coming over in the morning. When I arrived at her place, Marla met me at the door, still in scrub's eyes, red from a night shift, and something heavier. I scanned her driveway with a laser level, a measurable 1.8-inch drop over 20 feet. Inside the garage, a hairline crack ran from the foundation stem wall to the overhead door track. I laid a geophone on her back patio and watched the trace spike with micro tremors no human should feel. It's not surface settling, I told her quietly. The shockwave redirected stress. It's migrating. Toward the main block. All of it. She went pale. I emailed Karen yesterday. What did she say? That I should have installed better flooring anchors when we bought the house. Marla laughed, but it cracked in the middle. Flooring anchors? Like this is a loose cabinet. I added her data to the growing file and marked the county report urgent, imminent, subsidence, risk. The queue was still weeks long, and the HOA still had time to lie to cover to smile for the next photo op. That weekend, Karen threw a community wine mixer in the cul-de-sac directly above the blast zone. White tents, fairy lights, a 3-piece jazz trio playing Girl from Ipanema, while the ground beneath them slowly tore itself apart. I wasn't invited, but I went anyway. I wore my old Class A jacket medals polished for the first time in 15 years. Not for intimidation, for clarity. She spotted me the instant I stepped onto the asphalt. Her smile stretched like plastic about to tear. Well, she said, raising a plastic wine glass of something pink, look, who finally crawled out of the bunker. You're one fracture away from a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I answered calm and low. She stepped closer, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This is a private event, Mr. Easton. And that's a publicly recorded geological fault you just agitated with high explosives. You're not scaring anyone. I'm not trying to scare, I'm trying to warn. When someone's living room swallows their couch, don't say I didn't tell you exactly how it would happen. She gave a short, sharp laugh that didn't reach her eyes. You really think you know more than the professionals I hired? I know what happens when you set charges on metamorphic sediment sitting on an unreinforced fault scarp. I've seen villages disappear for less. For one heartbeat, something flickered behind her makeup doubt, raw and naked. Then pride slammed the door shut. You're just a bitter old man clinging to rocks, she hissed. No, I said, meeting her stare. I'm a bitter old man who buried friends because someone ignored warnings exactly like the ones I gave you. The jazz trio hit a sour note. A few heads turned. Karen's cheeks flushed beneath her bronzer. She spun away, wine sloshing, and raised her glass to the crowd. Cheers to progress, she called, voice bright again. They cheered with her oblivious. I left before the next song, the taste of ash thick on my tongue. That night I heard it again, a low subterranean yawn. The slow grind of pressure redistributing itself through stone that had been content to sleep for centuries. My bedroom window rattled once, just enough to remind me the ridge was still listening. So I made a decision. If they refused to hear a man's voice, maybe they'd finally hear the voice of the ground itself. The morning it finally spoke was bright, crisp, and wrong. The sky was a hard, flawless blue. The kind of blue that usually belongs to postcards, not to days when the earth decides to collect its debts. There were no birds, no squirrels. Even the wind had stopped, as though the mountain itself had drawn one long, deliberate breath and was waiting to exhale. I was on the back deck, hunched over my workbench, reviewing the latest thermal scans from the drone's overnight pass, when the first crack arrived. Not an explosion this time, more intimate. A brittle, crawling snap that started somewhere deep in the granite and climbed toward daylight like a vine of pure violence. Then the world dropped an inch and came back up angry. The ridge lurched hard enough to throw me backward. My coffee mug leapt off the table and shattered against the planks. The pines whipped as if a giant hand had slapped them. A second heavier concussion rolled through the rock, not the sharp pop of dynamite, but the dull, bone-deep thump of something ancient tearing loose. Dust billowed from the lower slope in a choking gray column. Somewhere below, car alarms began screaming in chorus. I knew instantly this was no aftershock of their blast. This was the answer. I grabbed my jacket, the field tablet, and ran. The trail down was already treacherous. Fresh fissures zigzagged across the dirt like lightning frozen mid-flash. 2 construction trucks sat abandoned at the blast site doors, hanging open, crews standing in stunned silence, staring at the ground as though it had betrayed them personally. What the hell was that? I shouted at the nearest worker. He couldn't speak, he only pointed. A cracked no, a canyon had opened where the blast trench had been. 10 inches wide, in places black and hungry, it ran in a drunken, jagged line straight across the detonation zone and arrowed northeast, straight toward the heart of Summit Heights. Steam hissed from its depths, carrying the smell of hot stone and wet clay. I dropped to one knee and shoved the tablet's GPR probe into the fissure. The screen lit up red almost instantly. Displacement column 14.2 feet deep, and climbing angle of propagation 22 degrees, heading directly beneath the residential rows. The dynamite hadn't just shifted rock. It had tripped the lock on a fault that had been asleep since the Pleistocene. I sprinted back uphill, boots skidding on loose gravel, lungs burning. Every footfall sent a sympathetic tremor through the soil, as though the ridge were flinching at my weight. At the crest, I skidded to a stop and looked down on the HOA block. The first buckle appeared right in front of Marla Jameson's house. A 10-foot section of sidewalk lifted clean out of the ground, rising 6 inches like a drawbridge no one had asked for. A mailbox toppled sideways. Sprinkler heads popped off and spun in frantic circles, spraying arcs of water into the morning light. People stumbled out of front doors in bathrobes and pajamas, phones already up, mouths open in perfect circles of disbelief. Karen stood barefoot on her driveway in silk pajamas and a clipboard still clutching the damn clipboard, staring at her front step as it cracked neatly down the middle with a sound like a gunshot. Then the real movement began. A long, low rumble rolled up from the depths, slow and deliberate, gathering force the way a freight train gathers speed inside a tunnel. The ground didn't shake. It undulated. Sidewalks split into offset slabs. A retaining wall behind house number 12 unzipped from top to bottom in one clean, terrifying tear. Karen's porch light flickered once and died. The two halves of her front step slid 3 inches apart, revealing a dark gap that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. Screams rose sharp and animal. A man in gym shorts tried to muscle his garage door open, while the entire driveway slumped beneath him like wet cement. 2 sedans rolled backward into a newborn sinkhole, metal shrieking. Water mains ruptured somewhere underground. Geysers shot 20 feet high, rainbowed in the sun. And beneath it all, the sound I had dreaded most, the slow inhale of soil as vacuum replaced solid earth. Dust swirled downward instead of up. Trees along the fracture line leaned inward, roots creaking like old ship masts. I vaulted the low fence into Marla's yard just as her front door flew open. Her 2 kids bolted out, screaming, barefoot, faces white. Marla was right behind them, dragging a go-bag and a look of pure terror. "Get them up the hill," I roared. "My place now." She didn't argue. We ran. Behind us, the tremors ebbed into an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that follows a gunshot, when everyone is waiting to see who's hit. When we reached my driveway, I turned back for one last look. 3 houses visibly sagged at the corners. A blue SUV sat cocked at a 20-degree angle, one wheel dangling over nothing. Lawn sprinklers still hissed like dying snakes. Dust hung in the air so thick the rooftops looked ghosted. Karen hadn't moved. She stood in the middle of her fractured driveway, barefoot silk pajamas streaked with dust, staring at the gap that now separated her front door from the rest of the world. The clipboard hung loose at her side, papers fluttering away like white flags. I walked down to her slowly. "You need to evacuate the entire block," I said, voice flat. She looked up. The makeup was gone, the power suit replaced by pajamas, but the denial was still there, clinging like a second skin. This can't be happening," she whispered. "They said the rock was stable." The engineer signed off. "No licensed geologist ever signed a damn thing," I told her. "And I warned you. On camera. In writing. In person. You hit a stress shelf with high explosives. This was supposed to be an earthquake-proof neighborhood," she said, voice cracking. "No, you just made it an earthquake." Behind her, neighbors were starting to gather in loose, frightened knots, phones trembling in their hands. Some stared at the cracks. Some stared at Karen. The first whispers of blame were already forming. Marla touched my arm. "Michael, is it over?" I watched a new hairline fracture snake across the street toward house number 9 and felt the ground give another almost imperceptible sigh. "No," I said softly. "It's only just begun." The aftershocks arrived like unwelcome house guests, subtle, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Every few hours, the ground beneath Summit Heights would twitch just enough to rattle picture frames, to send a ripple through a glass of water left on a counter, to crack a fresh line in already compromised drywall. Not the dramatic quakes of Hollywood, but the insidious kind that eroded confidence 1 millimeter at a time. Like the earth was clearing its throat, reminding everyone, "I haven't forgotten, and I'm not finished." I'd lived through this script before. In Helmand Province, a careless demo team had nudged a shallow fault under a forward operating base. What followed was 6 weeks of creeping subsidence that swallowed tents, vehicles, and eventually the confidence of an entire platoon. In Chile, a quarry expansion triggered a slow-motion landslide that ate a suburb hillside house by house. This was the same pattern, only here the culprits wore polo shirts and drank boxed Chardonnay on patios that were now tilting like sinking ships. The HOA tried to smother the panic in bureaucracy at first. They fired off an email blast titled "Routine Soil Settling, No Cause for Alarm," and assured everyone that temporary cosmetic damage was perfectly normal after minor earthworks. They blamed subsurface hydration cycles and seasonal thermal expansion. Karen even trotted out another phantom expert, a Dr. Elena Vasquez soil dynamics specialist, who allegedly confirmed everything was within acceptable parameters. A quick search revealed Dr. Vasquez was a high school biology teacher in Tucson with a side hustle selling essential oils. But the ground refused to play along with the fiction. House number 14 sprouted a diagonal fissure from the front door frame straight to the living room picture window. You could slide a credit card into the gap and watch daylight on the other side. Kids stopped biking near the fracture zone, as if the asphalt might open and swallow them whole. Dogs whined and scratched at doors, refusing to cross certain patches of lawn. Late at night, residents whispered about sounds in the soil loci. Distant groans, the eerie creak of something immense, adjusting its weight beneath their foundations. Fear took root, but blame lagged behind. People in places like Summit Heights crave authority, even when it's rotten. They want a calm voice, saying, "We've got this," even if the voice is lying through capped teeth. Karen was masterful at that role, the unflappable leader steering the ship through a storm she herself had summoned, until the street finally opened its mouth. It happened 4 days after the activation on a Tuesday. So ordinary, it felt obscene. Midday sun, clear skies, a woman named Lisa Chen, reversing her silver sedan out of her garage for a grocery run. The rear tires crossed the hairline crack that had appeared overnight. The asphalt gave a tired sigh and collapsed. The car lurched backward into a sudden 3-foot depression, back bumper shearing off with a metallic scream. Lisa wasn't hurt, just shaken, but her shriek echoed down the block like a starting gun. The HOA dubbed it a localized pavement anomaly in their next bulletin and promised prompt repairs. But by evening, city inspectors were on site. Someone, Lisa, a neighbor, maybe even an anonymous tip, had filed a formal hazard report with the county. Once official boots hit the ground, the carefully constructed lies began to crack faster than the concrete. I watched from my porch as the inspectors unfolded their gear, ground-penetrating radar units, core sampling drills, drone swarms, mapping elevation changes in real time. They worked in grids, marking flaws with spray paint red for critical, yellow for monitor, orange for evacuate. One engineer, a wiry guy with a clipboard and a hard hat, paused at the original blast trench, stared at the slope for a long 30 seconds, then muttered something to his partner that carried on the wind. This wasn't settling. This was triggered. I knew it was time to hand over the keys to the kingdom. I walked down with my own binder drone footage, time-stamped before and after seismic logs, graphing the exact moment the fault woke, thermal maps showing heat blooms along the fracture plane. The lead inspector, Ms. Patel, a no-nonsense woman with steel in her eyes, flipped through it page by page, her jaw tightening with every overlay. "You documented all this prior to their detonation?" she asked. "Every frame," I said. "They were warned in writing, on video, in person, multiple times." She nodded once, grim. "We'll be escalating to emergency assessment. This goes beyond HOA jurisdiction now." "About damn time," I replied. The next morning, Summit Heights looked like a war zone in slow motion. City trucks blocked streets with orange cones. Survey stakes sprouted from lawns like plastic flowers. Yellow caution tape fluttered between houses. And then the narrative shattered wide open. Karen showed up at my door unannounced. No entourage, no clipboard. Just her makeup free, for the first time I'd ever seen hair in a messy ponytail, holding a manila folder that trembled slightly in her hands. "I need to talk," she said, voice small. I stepped aside and let her in, curiosity outweighing contempt. She didn't sit. She stood in the center of my living room, eyes darting to the maps pinned on the wall, the seismic printouts stacked on the coffee table. "The city's saying we may have violated civil construction ordinances," she started, words rushing out. "That we needed a secondary impact review after the initial blast. That lives were endangered. You needed a full geological EIR before you ever drilled the first hole I corrected. We had consultants. You had yes men who told you what your ego ordered." She flinched. "Some families are talking evacuation. Insurance is denying claims left and right. Act of God doesn't cover man-made fault activation. The board, it's fracturing. They want a scapegoat. And you're here to get ahead of the story." She met my eyes. Then something raw, flickering there. "Mr. Easton, I know you care about this ridge, this community, even if you hate the board. If you issued a joint statement with me, something calm, reassuring, we could dial down the panic. Buy time." I let the silence stretch until it hurt. "You want me," I said slowly, "to stand beside you and lie to these people, to help bury the fact that you ignored a military engineer's warnings, dynamited a dormant fault, and turned a neighborhood into a slow-motion disaster zone." She opened her mouth, closed it. I stepped closer. "You held that detonator like a trophy. You called it progress. You mocked me when I told you the ground would fight back. Please," she whispered the word, breaking like thin ice. "I wasn't unkind. I didn't yell. I just pointed to the door. Get off my property." She left the folder on the table, copies of internal emails I'd discover later, and walked out without looking back. That night, house number 17 earned its first red tag. Unsafe structure. Vacate immediately. Spray painted in bold letters across the garage door. The next day, 2 more followed. City notices hammered to front doors like eviction notices from the earth itself. Geological instability. Structural compromise. Evacuation strongly recommended. Some residents packed U-Hauls in stunned silence. Others stood on lawns, staring at their tilting homes like they were strangers. Kids cried. Dogs barked at nothing. And I stood on the ridge watching the land reclaim what arrogance had tried to steal. The next few days blurred into a slow-motion emergency clipboards, caution tape, and the constant low hum of generators powering inspection lights long after dark. Every sunrise brought new colored flags sprouting from lawns yellow for monitor orange, for caution red for condemned. The neighborhood began to look like a topographical war map drawn by a sadistic child. Yet the HOA still refused to admit fault in public. Their emails kept arriving sterile and robotic. We understand concerns are being raised. The board is actively reviewing feedback. Residents are encouraged to remain calm during this transitional period, as if calm were something you could order from a catalog along with replacement mailboxes. Karen had vanished from sight. Her porch lights stayed dark, her overflowing mailbox became a neighborhood joke, and the kids started calling her house the Cracked Castle. I didn't laugh. I knew what it looked like when shame calcified into silence. What the board never anticipated was how quickly the fear they had spent years weaponizing, fear of untrimmed hedges, fear of the wrong shade of beige, would turn and bite them. They started coming to my door one by one. The same people who once voted to fine me for a fence post 2 inches too tall, who filed anonymous complaints when I ran my table saw after 6 p.m., now stood on my porch with folders and flash drives and the haunted eyes of people who had just watched their largest investment tilt 3 degrees off plumb. They didn't come for apologies. They came for help. Greg Pulaski, retired accountant, former Karen cheerleader, handed me a thick envelope and whispered, "These are board meeting emails I downloaded before they locked the portal. Thought someone should have them." Inside were 6 months of correspondence, rushed votes, ignored objections. A single anonymous board member later identified as Tom Alvarez, pleading for a geological review and being shut down in real time. One email from Karen ended with the line, "We move forward, or we explain to the membership why their dues are going up again. Choose." I forwarded everything to Life and to the State Oversight Board the same night. 2 days later, Leaf Danner arrived like an avenging angel in a dusty Tacoma, loaded with Sensors core barrels and a look that said he had seen entire valleys disappear for less. "This is criminal malpractice," he announced, before he even stepped out of the truck. That fault was locked and happy for 40,000 years. They just kicked it in the teeth with ANFO. He spent the day planting instruments along the fracture trace. By late afternoon, he was shaking his head at the screen. "Bifurcation," he muttered. "One arm running east under your ridge stable for now, the other slicing northwest straight through the middle of the subdivision. It's active, Michael, not theoretical, active. Slow creep maybe half an inch a day, but it's moving. Could it drop the whole block? If we get a wet winter, possibly. More likely you'll see differential subsidence houses tearing themselves apart from the inside out over the next 6 to 18 months. That evening I called a meeting, not an HOA meeting, a real one. We gathered on the upper slope behind my house, under the pines that had somehow survived everything. Marla brought folding chairs. A young couple hauled a cooler of lemonade. Word had traveled fast. 32 people showed up, some still in work clothes, others clutching printouts of insurance denial letters. Leaf stood beside me while I laid out the maps on a portable table, before and after drone imagery, GPR cross-sections, thermal blooms showing where the fault was exhaling heat like a sleeping dragon turning over. I kept it plain. Your homes are sitting on a geologic shelf that is now sliding millimeter by millimeter. The blasting didn't cause an earthquake. It removed the last keystone holding an old fault shut. The HOA was warned verbally in writing with data, and chose to proceed anyway. Then Leaf spoke, no drama, just facts. You have months, not years, before some of these foundations become unsalvageable. You need to document everything file claims, and hold the responsible parties liable before they bankrupt the association and disappear. A long silence followed. You could hear the wind moving through the pines and nothing else. Finally, Greg, the same Greg who once tried to find me for an unpermitted birdhouse, stood up. So what the hell do we actually do? You organize, I said. You form a real committee, not a rubber stamp board. You demand transparency. You sue if you have to. And you start with the people who lit the fuse. Marla raised her hand. Can we force a recall election? With enough signatures, yes, tonight. Something shifted in the air subtle, as the first tremor but unmistakable fear turning into resolve. By midnight, we had a name, the Ridge Preservation Group, 27 signatures on a recall petition, and a stack of USB drives containing every damning email vote log and buried geological memo the board thought they had erased. At 12:47 a.m., a small delegation walked to Karen's dark house and slid the recall demand under her door along with 3 official envelopes, one from the city inspector, one from the state geotechnical board, and one from the county DA marked Notice of Investigation. She never answered. The following morning, the Office of Emergency Services called me directly. We're opening a formal inquiry into man-induced fault reactivation, the woman said. Your documentation is the backbone of the case. Thank you. By noon, the county had officially designated Summit Heights a geologically compromised zone. Insurance carriers were notified. Property values began a freefall that would make Wall Street blush. And the HOA's lawyers finally stopped returning calls. Karen's silence became a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured the truth, raw, ugly, and undeniable. That night, I stood alone on the ridge again, boots planted on rock that had chosen for the moment to stay still. Below me, porch lights flickered on one by one, not in celebration, but in defiance. People were talking across fences for the first time in years. Real talking. About real things. A community that no longer trusted its keepers had finally begun to trust one another. By the end of that week, the HOA had lost the war without firing a single honest shot. The organization that once terrorized the neighborhood with pastel newsletters, $150 fines for visible recycling bins, and mandatory Christmas light color palettes, was now a hollow shell. Emails still arrived auto-scheduled unsigned, written in the same corporate, zombie voice. Please continue to pay your dues on time. The board is monitoring the situation. We appreciate your patience during this temporary inconvenience. But nobody was listening anymore. Karen had not been seen in daylight for 5 full days. Her curtains stayed drawn, her Amazon packages piled up like sandbags against a flood that had already breached the walls. The kids had stopped calling her house the Cracked Castle and started calling it the Haunted Mansion. Even the dogs no longer barked when they passed. I started getting quiet, almost embarrassed visits from people who used to cross the street to avoid me. A former board treasurer showed up with a bottle of 18-year-old scotch and a flash drive. I was told to delete this, he muttered. Figured someone should have it before they wiped the server. Tom Alvarez came on a Tuesday evening looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him at the wine mixer. He stood on my porch in the rain collar, turned up holding a dripping manila envelope. I was the only one who voted no, he said without greeting. Karen threatened to remove my voting rights if I kept obstructing progress. I should have resigned then and there. You're here now, I answered. That counts. He handed me the envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a single printed page, the original geological risk memo, dated 8 months earlier, stamped received by the county, then mysteriously vanished from every official file. The memo ended with the sentence, controlled blasting within 200 feet of mapped fault trace is not recommended under any circumstances. Tom's voice cracked. She told us she'd have a private firm revise the language to make it friendlier. We never saw it again. I took the drive, the memo, and the weight of his regret. That night, I compiled everything into one master file. The buried memo, the vote logs, the private Slack channel where Karen wrote, just get it done before the old man on the ridge files another complaint, contractor invoices showing corners cut on blast mats and seismic monitoring. My own seismic data synced to the exact second of detonation. I emailed the package to Leaf to Ms. Patel at the county, and with Tom's permission to every resident on the Ridge Preservation Group list. By morning, the neighborhood was on fire, not literally, but close. A spontaneous rally formed outside the HOA office at 9:00 a.m. 47 people, then 60, then nearly 100. Hand-painted signs, Karen lied. We slide, my house is cracking. Where's my dues? Money dissolve the board. Save our homes. No one had organized it. Someone just started a group text titled "Enough and the Dam Broke." I watched from the ridge road as the crowd grew. Marla stood on a folding chair reading the buried memo aloud through a megaphone borrowed from a high school marching band parent. When she got to the line about not recommended under any circumstances, the cheering was loud enough to rattle my windows half a mile away. At 3:17 p.m., the hammer fell. A white county truck pulled up to the HOA office. Two officials in hard hats climbed the steps and nailed a single sheet of paper to the glass door. Cease and desist order. State Geotechnical Oversight Committee and all board-led construction development and earth-altering activities are hereby suspended pending full investigation under Fault Activation Statute 19C. Violation is a felony. The crowd went dead silent for 3 heartbeats, then erupted louder than before. Karen's empire cracked wider than any fissure in the ground. They tried one last emergency board meeting that evening. Only 5 people showed up, 2 of them just to shout. The rest of the seats stayed empty, a silent referendum. And then just after sunset she appeared. Not in a power suit. Not with a clipboard. Just Karen Atwell in faded sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, hair unwashed, eyes ringed with the purple of sleepless nights. She walked to the HOA office, steps alone, stood beneath the flickering security light, looked at the cease and desist notice, at the empty folding chairs, at the taped-up recall petitions, fluttering like surrender flags. She opened her mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to scream, but nothing came out. After 30 seconds, she turned and walked away into the dark. She never said a word. She didn't need to. The throne she had built on arrogance and other people's money had been swallowed by the very ground she tried to conquer. 3 weeks later, I sat in a municipal courtroom that smelled of bleach and old coffee, a 3-inch binder on my lap, and the weight of 12 years on this ridge pressing against my ribs. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about every person who had been told their voice didn't matter because they didn't wear the right blazer. The room was packed. Residents filled every bench, shoulder to shoulder, clutching folders, thick with photos of cracked foundations, insurance denials, children's drawings of their tilting houses. Karen sat across the aisle, flanked by 2 lawyers whose suits cost more than most of the damaged roofs. She wore muted gray hair pulled back severely, face stripped of every trace of the woman who once held a detonator like a scepter. Judge Celia Tran entered sharp-eyed and unimpressed by theatrics. She had already read Leaf's affidavit, the city's report, and my 27-page exhibit package. The clerk called the case Summit Heights HOA vs. Emergency Civil Petition for Injunction and Liability, Fault Activation, and Public Endangerment. The city geotech went first, laying out the timeline with cold precision blast dates, tremor spikes, fault propagation vectors. Leaf's overlays were projected on a screen large enough for the back row to see the exact moment the ridge woke up. Then the residents testified. Marla voiced steady as steel the day her patio split while her kids played 10 feet away. Greg the accountant, the rushed vote, the threats, the buried memo. Tom Alvarez under oath, pale but unflinching, how Karen suppressed evidence and bullied dissent. Every story landed like another crack in the foundation of the HOA's defense. When they called my name, I walked to the stand carrying 12 years of muscle memory from war zones and disaster theaters. State your name and qualification. Michael Easton, retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. 26 years, 12 in terrain hazard mitigation and post-blast structural assessment. Why are you here, Mr. Easton? Because I warned them, repeatedly, with data. And they chose cupcakes and a photo op over human lives. I laid out the timeline again, flags, emails, drone footage, seismic graphs. When Karen's attorney tried to claim the fault was naturally active, I looked him dead in the eye. A grizzly bear is naturally active too, until you throw dynamite into its den. The judge allowed it. A few residents actually laughed, short, sharp, relieved. Closing arguments were brief. The HOA's lawyers blamed contractors whether unforeseeable subsurface conditions. They had no experts left who would risk their license. Judge Tran recessed for exactly 1 hour. We waited in the hallway like soldiers waiting for medevac. Karen paced in circles, lawyers whispering urgently. Residents clustered around vending machines, passing around a bag of homemade cookies someone had brought for courage. When the bailiff called us back, the room went still enough to hear the air conditioning hum. Judge Tran did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. After review of the evidence testimony and applicable statutes, this court finds that the Summit Heights Homeowners Association, under the direct leadership of President Karen Atwell, did knowingly and willfully disregard multiple credible warnings, bypass required geological review, and proceed with high explosive blasting that directly triggered the reactivation of a dormant fault, resulting in widespread property damage and endangerment of human life. Effective immediately. Full suspension of all HOA board authority. 2. Appointment of an independent trustee to manage finances and repairs. 3. Establishment of a court-monitored liability fund for affected homeowners to be seeded from HOA reserves and, if necessary, personal assets of responsible board members. 4. Referral of Ms. Karen Atwell to the State Ethics Board for potential civil and criminal review. The gavel fell like the final detonation we never wanted. The room exhaled as one. Karen went white, then gray. Her lawyers started packing briefs they would never file. Residents wept openly, some from relief, some from the sudden realization that the nightmare had a price tag, and someone else was finally paying it. Hands reached for me, back slaps, hugs, tears on my shoulder. Marla squeezed me so hard I felt a rib protest. Outside in the sunlight, someone started clapping. Then everyone did. A slow, rolling applause that followed me all the way to my truck. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt the ridge under my boots again, solid, patient, and finally at peace. The morning after the verdict, the county returned in force, this time, not to inspect, but to enforce. Yellow tape went up like crime scene ribbons around entire cul-de-sacs. Red placards were hammered to front doors with the finality of nails in a coffin, unsafe. Do not enter structural failure, imminent geological hazard zone. 3 houses were condemned outright. 12 more were yellow tagged for limited occupancy. Homeowners stood on lawns holding toddlers and crying into phones while movers carried furniture to pods that looked like bright plastic tombs. Marla organized a volunteer convoy, church vans, pickup trucks, borrowed trailers. The local Baptist annex became a dormitory. A GoFundMe titled Summit Heights Fault Victims hit $100,000 in 6 hours. I walked the ridge at dusk, boots crunching over gravel that no longer shifted beneath me. Down below, contractors in Tyvek suits hammered plywood over broken windows and pumped expanding foam into widening foundation cracks. It was triage, nothing more. You can brace a house, you can't unwake a fault. The news cycle devoured the story like wildfire. Local stations led with drone shots of the fracture scar glowing orange in thermal imaging. National blogs called it the HOA that broke a mountain. One late-night host joked that Karen Atwell had invented a new extreme sport, competitive tectonic sabotage. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing interview requests, podcast invites, a producer who wanted to turn it into a limited series starring Bryan Cranston as me. I let it all go to voicemail. Karen resigned at 2:17 a.m. 2 days later. The email was 3 lines long, no salutation, no signature. I resigned from my position as president of the Summit Heights Homeowners Association. Effective immediately. The board will issue further guidance. It landed in inboxes like a corpse dropped on the doorstep. She was gone by the following dawn. A silver moving truck backed into her driveway at 5:45 a.m. 2 men in coveralls loaded boxed-up flat screens and designer handbags while she stood on the porch in sunglasses and yesterday's clothes staring up at my ridge as if it might offer absolution. I watched from my kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hand. She never waved, never looked ashamed, just climbed into a waiting Uber and disappeared down the hill that was no longer hers to rule. The HOA dissolved officially 10 days later. The court-appointed trustee announced that reserves were nearly depleted, legal fees, emergency repairs, and consulting invoices that smelled suspiciously like hush money. A special assessment was inevitable. Some residents screamed. Others just nodded. They had already lost everything that mattered. But something unexpected grew in the vacuum. The Ridge Preservation Group, now simply called Summit Watch, rewrote the bylaws from scratch. No more elected dictators. No more secret votes. Every decision required a public forum and a 60% resident quorum. They asked me to sit on the first council. I declined politely but firmly. "This part isn't mine anymore," I told Marla. "You stood up, now you stand tallest." She accepted with tears in her eyes, and got to work. Within a month, the neighborhood began to breathe again, not the ominous inhale of shifting earth, but the slow human rhythm of people choosing to stay and fight for what was left. FEMA finished its final hazard map. 3 homes were total losses bulldozed and seeded with native grass. 12 required steel piers and helical anchors driven 60 feet into bedrock. But the ridge itself, my ridge, Carol's Ridge, had held. The blast trench that was meant to scar it forever had instead become the pressure release valve that saved the upper slope from catastrophic slide. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. One warm afternoon, I took Carol's wind chimes down from the porch hook, polished the tarnished tubes until they gleamed, and hung them again. The first breeze of spring moved through them like a sigh of relief. I sat in my old chair and listened, really listened for the first time in months. No groans from the deep. No tremor in the coffee mug. Just wind clean and uncomplicated, telling the only story that mattered we endured. A few days later, 2 boys, 10, maybe 11, were playing at the edge of the old blast zone with plastic excavators and a serious narrative. "Careful," one shouted. "If you blast too close to the fault, the whole street falls in." The other looked up, saw me, and grinned. "Hey, mister, are you the guy who stopped the big boom?" I crouched to their level. "Depends. You planning to build a road or start a war?" "A road," they chorused. "Then always check the maps first," I said, tapping the dirt with a stick. "And never ever ignore the old man on the ridge." They nodded solemnly, as if I'd handed them the keys to the universe. That night, I opened the footlocker I hadn't touched since the funeral medals deployment photos, Carol's folded flag. At the bottom was a small envelope in her handwriting. "You don't have to fight everything, Michael. But when the ground shifts, you'll know which battles are yours. I'm proud of you already. C." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my shirt pocket right over my heart. The ridge was quiet again, truly quiet. Not the loaded silence of held breath, but the deep earned stillness of stone that has spoken its piece and chosen to rest. Spring arrived the way it always does, on the ridge first, in tiny defiant bursts, wild mustard, pushing through the blast scar lupine, seeding itself in the fresh cracks. Hummingbirds returning to the exact same feeder hook they'd used for a decade. Then all at once, a green tide that rolled up the slope and erased the last gray traces of winter and dynamite dust. The neighborhood healed in uneven patches, the way soldiers do. New asphalt went down on the worst streets this time, with proper compaction tests and a county geologist on site every single day. Someone painted a mural on the longest repaired retaining wall, a stylized ridgeline with the words, "We hold," in bold white letters. Every kid who walked to the bus stop touched it for luck. Summit watched the new council ran its first open meeting in the community park under a rented canopy. Folding tables, mismatched lawn chairs, a cooler of lemonade, and 0 clipboards. Marla chaired it with the calm authority of a woman who had once carried her children out of a house that was trying to eat them. They voted on paint colors, mailbox standards, even whether to allow chickens. They did 68 to 32. No one was fined. No one was threatened. Someone brought cookies. I was invited as honorary elder, which made me laugh until my ribs hurt. I brought Carol's peach cobbler in the old cast-iron skillet. It disappeared in 12 minutes flat. Greg Pulaski handed me a cold soda and said, "The only crack I care about now is the one in my barbecue lid." We clinked cans like old comrades. Insurance settlements trickled in slow, infuriating, never enough, but they came. Peering crews worked house by house, drilling to bedrock, pumping, grout, lifting foundations inch by careful inch. Kids drew chalk hopscotch grids over fresh concrete patches and pretended the red survey stakes were goalposts. One Saturday in May, a young couple knocked on my door. They had just closed on the rebuilt house at the bend, the one that had tilted worst. She wore a baby in a sling. He carried a notebook and a hopeful smile. "We heard you know this ridge better than anyone," he said. "We want to plant a native garden in the back. Could you show us where the ground breathes slowest?" I grabbed my hat and walked them around the side of the house. We stood where the old blast trench used to be now, just a gentle swale filled with bunchgrass and owl's clover. I pointed out the firm bedrock shelf, the natural drainage line, the spot where morning sun lingered longest without baking the soil. "Right here," I said, pressing my boot into the earth. "This piece never moved. Plant your oaks here. They'll outlive all of us." They took furious notes. Asked 100 questions, listened the way people listen when they finally understand. The ground isn't just something you put a house on. It's something you negotiate with. That night, I flew the drone one last time. The old battery was swollen and cranky, but it lifted anyway, climbing into a sky the color of peach cobbler. From 300 feet, the ridge looked whole again. The fracture scar was a faint silver thread, already softening under new growth. Rooftops glowed warm below me, porch lights flicking on like slow fireflies. Children's laughter rose clear and sharp on the evening air. Somewhere a dog barked joy instead of warning. I let the drone hover until the battery warning screamed, then brought it home and set it on the workbench beside Carol's wind chimes. It was done. Its work, like mine, was finished. Later, when the stars came out thick and bright, the way they only do at elevation, I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon I had been saving for a night I could taste again. The chimes sang their soft, random song, 3 notes Carol had chosen because they reminded her of church bells back in Tennessee. For the first time since the first orange flag appeared, I felt the ridge breathe with me instead of against me. The chaos was over. The ridge had endured. The people had endured. And somewhere in the dark, the wind carried Carol's laughter the way it always had, quiet, steady, unbreakable. I still walk the trail every morning, same as I did when Carol was alive. Boots-laced, tight-field notebook in my back pocket, thermos of black coffee steaming in the crisp air. Old habits don't fade. They settle into your bones like layers of sedimentary rock, quiet and unbreakable. I note the small things now, the way the manzanita has reclaimed the blast scar with glossy red bark, how the erosion gullies have softened into gentle swales, the return of quail families scratching through the underbrush as if nothing ever happened. Nature doesn't forget what you do to it, but it forgives slowly and on its own terms if you finally learn to listen. One afternoon in early summer, a delivery truck rumbled up my gravel drive. The driver handed me a flat package wrapped in brown paper, no return address, postmarked from a town 3 states away. Inside was a single photograph, Karen Atwell standing alone on a flat, treeless plain, wind whipping her hair, the background nothing but endless sky and regret. On the back, in handwriting, I recognized from 100 HOA bulletins she had written, "You were right. The ground always wins. I'm sorry." No signature, no plea for forgiveness. Just those 3 lines, small and careful, like she was afraid the paper might crack if she pressed too hard. I stood on the porch a long time, turning the photo over in my hands. I thought about rage, about vindication, about the satisfaction I once imagined I'd feel watching her empire crumble. None of it came. Only a quiet ache for the woman who had mistaken control for community, ambition for progress, and never once looked up at the ridge in wonder. I slipped the photo between the pages of Carol's old gardening journal and let it go. Summit Heights isn't perfect. Never will be. Some houses still bear the faint scars of helical piers marching across their foundations like metal stitches. A few families never came back. For sale signs lingered longer than anyone wanted. But the ones who stayed built something stronger than bylaws or perfectly manicured lawns. They built trust. Kids ride bikes without looking over their shoulders for the fine police. Porches host actual conversations instead of passive-aggressive notes. The mural on the retaining wall has been touched up twice already, the letters "We Hold" brighter each time. Marla's native garden at the Bend is thriving. The young couple named their new oak Easton and send me photos every month of its first brave leaves. I teach a little now, nothing formal. A Saturday here, a Sunday there. I show the kids how to read contour lines on a topo map, how to spot tension cracks before they become canyons, how to press a seismic probe into the soil and listen for the Earth's heartbeat. They call me the Ridge Whisperer, with the solemn respect children reserve for superheroes and grandfathers. I never correct them. Some evenings, I sit with Greg on his repaired patio, sharing a beer while the sun melts into the layered hills Carol loved so much. We don't talk about the blasts or the courtroom much anymore. We talk about grandkids, about the new barbecue pit he finally built, without asking permission, about how quiet the nights are, now that no one is afraid of the ground shifting beneath them. And every night without fail, I end the day on the porch. Carol's wind chimes catch the last breeze of daylight, singing their 3 soft notes across the ridge that never truly belonged to any of us. The rooftops below shimmer like fish scales again, the way they did the first morning I ever stood here with her hand in mine. No orange flags, no drilling rigs, no detonators raised like trophies. Just strength. Earned the hard way, held the right way, shared the only way that ever mattered. The ridge is mine again, and everyone's for good. I raise my glass to the dark pines, to the quiet houses, to the woman whose laughter still lives in the wind. And for the first time in 12 years, I sleep all the way through the night, dreaming not of explosions or cracks or warnings ignored, but of solid ground beneath my feet and the simple sacred peace we fought so hard to deserve. The story is over, the ridge endures, and so do we.